Roy Pinder is a lifelong resident of Spanish Wells in the Bahamas. He has spent decades as a fisherman and diver in the island's rich waters. On June 25, 1968, at the ripe old age of 17, Roy came face to face with a nightmare that nearly ended his life in those same waters. I'm Elle, and I'm a huge fan of survival stories. This week's story takes place in Spanish Wells. It's a small, tight-knit island settlement off the northern tip of Eleutheria in the Bahamas. It's often described as one of the prettiest and friendliest places in the entire country. With a population around 1,600, mostly fair-skinned descendants of the Eleutherian adventurers and the loyalists who settled there in the 1700s. The community still feels like a step back in time. There's whitewashed cottages with colorful shutters that line the narrow golf cart-only lanes. Pastel fishing boats bob in a harbor full of crawfish traps, and almost everyone you pass waves or stops to chat. It's known as the crawfish capital of the Bahamas. The island's economy has long revolved around lobster fishing, and its fleet of fast, sleek boats still supplies a huge portion of the nation's spiny lobster exports. Despite the occasional cruise ship day tripper or yacht dropping anchor, Spanish Wells has managed to keep its quiet, deeply religious, and dry, no alcohol sold on the island, character. Sunday church bells, conch salad at Pinder's grocery store, and sunsets over the bone-white sandbar remain the main events of daily life. The Pinder family is prominent in the Spanish Wells history and economy. Some of the family members own and operate Pinder's Supermarket. It's a well-stocked harborside store at 7th Street. It's a go-to for fresh produce, bohemian staples like Johnny Cakes, and even boat-accessible provisions for fishermen. The island's tight-knit Pinder clan make up a quarter of the population, with streets, boats, and businesses named after them. Roy Pinder was born and raised in the close-knit Salt Kiss community. He's the eldest son in a long line of Bahamian fishermen. Growing up in the 1950s and early 60s, life revolved around the sea from the moment he could walk. He hauled conch from the flats at low tide. He learned to read the color of the water from his father and uncles, and he raced little sailboats across the harbor with his cousins. By the age of 12, he was already free diving deeper than most adults. He handlined grouper off the reefs and sold his catch at the dock to buy parts for his first outboard motor. His playground was the ocean, spearfishing for dinner, gigging lobsters by flashlight on moonless nights, and exploring every cave and blue hole between Spanish Wells and the Devil's Backbone. June 25, 1968. It was a hot, humid day under a new moon, with visibility limited in the deep blue. Roy was free diving without scuba gear. He was relying solely on his lung capacity to hunt grouper with a spear gun. He descended to about 70 feet. He spotted his target at around 40 feet and fired a perfect shot, spearing a large grouper. Gripping the fish, he began his ascent towards the surface. His lungs were burning from the effort. Out of the murky depths, a shark, likely a Caribbean reef shark or possibly a silky shark. It charged him head-on. Its jaws clamped down directly on Roy's face and head in a brutal exploratory bite. The force tore into his skin and flesh, shredding his face as the shark thrashed. In the chaos, Roy dropped his spear gun, but instinctively, he grabbed the shark's jaws with both hands, prying desperately to free himself while fighting to hold his breath. Blood clouded the water around him. His diving buddy, watching from above, saw the horror unfold and plunged in without hesitation. Roy's buddy fired a spear into the shark, hitting it dead on. The wounded predator released Roy, but immediately turned its rage on his friend, charging with its mouth wide open. Undeterred, Roy's friend unleashed a second spear. This one went straight into the shark's gaping jaws and down its throat. The shark finally fled, leaving both men battered but alive. Roy broke the surface, gasping for air and screaming. His face was mangled, hanging in ribbons. His diving buddy hauled him into their boat and raced back to the dock in Spanish Wells. The boat ride back took less than 10 minutes, but it felt endless. Blood poured so heavily that his friend later said the floorboards were slick with it. When they tied up, by the grace of God, as Roy later put it, a group of American divers happened to be there. One of the divers was a medical student who immediately spotted Roy's severed temporal artery. He clamped down on the artery in Roy's head by using his thumb for the better part of an hour. This restricted massive blood loss long enough for help to arrive. Without quick thinking, Roy wouldn't have made it. Islanders ran for towels and ice. A small plane airlifted him to Princess Margaret Hospital in Nassau. Roy was pale and barely conscious. His cheeks, jaw, and forehead were ravaged by the shark's teeth. Surgeons worked through the night. The shark had taken triangular chunks out of both cheeks, split his upper lip to the nose, crushed the left side of his lower jaw, and left deep puncture marks in a row across his forehead and scalp. One tooth had sliced within millimeters of his left eye. The doctors removed shredded tissue, stitched severed muscles back to bone, and closed the wounds with roughly 400 sutures. If you count later revisions, it was closer to 500 sutures. Cosmetic surgery barely existed in the Bahamas back then. The goal was simple: keep him alive and get the skin to hold. For the first week, he was only fed liquids through a straw, because opening his mouth wider than a finger's width tore his stitches. Infections set in almost immediately. Seawater and shark bite bacteria are a brutal mix, so he ran high fevers and was packed in ice while penicillin and tetracycline were pumped into him. His mother stayed at the hospital the entire time, sleeping on a cot. His father came when the boat could spare him, bringing clean clothes and news from home. When his future wife, Linda, first visited him in the hospital, she later recalled, he didn't even look human. The pain was excruciating and the recovery was slow, but Roy's youth and resilience pulled him through. After 3 weeks, he was allowed to fly home. He was still swollen beyond recognition, with black stitches crisscrossing his face like a baseball. For months, he couldn't go in the sun, so he spent days indoors listening to the radio and nights on the porch where the breeze kept the swelling down. Children stopped staring after a while and just asked quietly, "Does it hurt?" It definitely did. Nerve damage sent electric jolts across his cheeks whenever wind hit them, and smiling pulled the scars so tight that tears came unexpectedly. Roughly 4 months later, he was back in the water. At first, he was just riding along to pull the traps, then spearfishing again, albeit with a new alertness. Roy had 4 or 5 minor revision surgeries in Nassau and Miami over the next decade to release scar tissue that tugged his left eye downward and made chewing painful. Each time he returned to Spanish Wells, he was a little less distorted until the dramatic lattice of scars settled into the rugged road map that people came to recognize as simply Roy's face. He never took painkillers long term. He never saw a therapist. The concept didn't exist there back then, and he refused to be called a victim. Instead, he told the story matter-of-factly, always ending with gratitude. The friend who speared the shark twice, the American student who held his artery shut, the pilots, the doctors, and above all, the man upstairs who decided 17 was too young for Roy to go. By the time he was in his 30s, the scars had silvered. The nerves had quieted. Roy wasted no time reclaiming the life the ocean had almost stolen. It's remarkable the attack didn't end his love for the ocean. He became one of Spanish Wells' most enduring lobster divers. For more than 30 years afterwards, he rebuilt boats, ran crawfish traps during the season, and spent weeks at a time living aboard his 25-foot open fisherman. He cooked over a kerosene stove. He was mending nets under the stars and emerging with hauls that fed the island and beyond. The attack had sharpened his instincts. He learned to read shark shadows in the current and always kept a second spear at the ready, but it never dimmed his reverence for the deep. In later years, his hobbies mellowed to guiding visitors on bone fishing trips, carving wooden mahi-mahi decoys, telling stories on the porch of Pinder's grocery store, and whenever the tide was right, slipping over the side with a mask and fins just to check the bottom, because for Roy, the sea was never work or sport alone. It was his home. As of 2024, Roy was very much alive and kicking at the age of 73. He was motoring his boat through the harbor with the same steady hand, though the years had slowed his dives to occasional jaunts. Roy Pinder married his wife, Linda May, on September 1st, 1969, in Spanish Wells, just over a year after his shark attack and his recovery. The couple went on to have 3 children, 1 daughter and 2 sons. As of January 2026, Roy Pinder still remains in Spanish Wells as a resident and a survivor of the 1968 shark attack. Have a good week. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.